Although it may sound strange at first, the denizens of Revolutionary-era America often used food to express their anger at the British. From the Boston Tea Party to the Coffee Riots, Americans would use food to declare their independence. Meals and ingredients associated with the British were rejected and replaced with homegrown alternatives. Today, we're going to take a look at some of the foods Americans ate during the Revolutionary War. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other culinary topics you would like to hear about. Okay, we hope you brought your patriotic appetite. We have some wonderful menu items for you today. Food was a valuable commodity during the Revolution, so Americans were sure to use every part of the animal, even the blood. Take, for example, the recipe for blood pudding from an 1805 cookbook by Hannah Glass. The directions call for mixing cornmeal with boiled milk or, failing that, water. Next, blood is stirred in, and the whole thing is mixed thoroughly. Finally, Glass recommends adding a molasses-based syrup called treacle, and for good measure, a little hog's lard. Cooks were advised to boil the blood pudding for up to 7 hours before serving it. When we said that Americans during the Revolution used every part of the animal, we meant it. Take, for example, Joseph Plum Martin, a private from Connecticut who recorded some of the more unusual foods he ate during the war. For example, on one occasion he boiled an old ox's liver. It probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't. Martin reports the meat gave him a terrible stomachache. After taking some medicine, Martin, in his own words, discharged the hard chunks of liver like grape shot from a field piece, which sounds just awful in every conceivable way. You would think an incident like that would make Martin pickier about what he ate, but no sir, not for that Connecticut private. Martin seemed to be especially fond of bits that, even then, others thought of as undesirable. This is illustrated in journals where, among other things, he also records eating a sheep's head, so it wouldn't go to waste, and an ox's milt, or spleen, which made him hurl. As anyone who has seen Hamilton can tell you, as soon as the American Revolution ended, Thomas Jefferson went to France. While he was there, the American founding father may have, for the first time in his life, tasted something many of us take for granted: ice cream. Yes, from the first moment he tried it, the dessert became a huge favorite with Jefferson. He's even the first American to create and popularize his own recipe for the stuff. As President of the United States, Jefferson is known to have served ice cream on at least 6 occasions. Manasseh Cutler, a congressman from Massachusetts who Jefferson introduced to ice cream, wrote of the experience, "Ice cream very good, crust wholly dried, crumbled into thin flakes." Sounds like a review from a caveman. "Ice cream very good, crust wholly dried, crumbled into thin flakes." Another White House guest marveled at the balls of the frozen material enclosed in covers of warm pastry, exhibiting a curious contrast, as if the ice had just been taken from the oven. The recipe for fire cake included water, flour, and not a single other thing. If that doesn't sound too appetizing to you, well, it didn't to Revolutionary soldiers either. In truth, they only ate fire cake when they absolutely had to. However, ration shortages during George Washington's winter at Valley Forge meant that many soldiers had no other option. To make it, they would mix their flour rations with water and then bake it in an iron kettle. Since there was no yeast involved, the cake was dense and basically tasteless. But if that sounds boring, there was a way it got spiced up. Maggots and weevils regularly got into the flour stores. Since there was basically nothing that could be done about it, the men would simply cook them up with the flour. Well, at least it added some protein to the meal. If you've never had it, anyone from Philly can tell you how good this meat concoction can be. Popularized by the Pennsylvania Dutch, scrapple was made from the leftover parts of a pig. That's right, it's the American Revolutionary version of the McRib. One recipe that dates all the way back to the Colonial period called for using the pig's head, feet, and any pieces which may be left after having made sausage meat. Is anyone else's mouth watering? The parts were to be tossed into a pot with salt and boiled until they were soft enough to allow for removal of the bones. Americans were in the habit of seasoning the meat with salt and pepper and adding Indian meal to thicken the mixture into something closer to a mush. After it was cooked, the chef was to slice the scrapple and then fry it in hot lard. scrapple, made from the best stuff on earth. Pumpkins were a new world food, and Americans of the Revolutionary era had several ways of incorporating them into their cooking. One of the most popular was a way that remains widely beloved today: pumpkin pie. In Hannah Glass's aforementioned cookbook of 1805, she carefully explains how the Founding Fathers made and ate their own pumpkin pie. According to Glass, the cook should peel a pumpkin and stew it until it gets soft. The recipe then called for 1 pint of pumpkin, 1 glass of rosewater, 1 pint of milk, and 1 glass of Malaga wine. After that, the recipe was rounded off with ½ pound of butter, sugar, salt, 7 eggs, and a dash of nutmeg. Like most people, George Washington enjoyed a drink from time to time, and just months after the Revolutionary War began, George Washington stocked up on Madeira wine. This particular wine was imported from the Portuguese colony of Madeira and might contain brandy or other sweeteners, depending on the variety. In preparation for what he knew would be an extended conflict, Washington ordered 1,900 bottles of the stuff. He wasn't the only founding father who was fond of the stuff either. In 1760, John Hancock underreported his Madeira wine imports to protest British import taxes, which led to a mob in Boston. The delegates to the First Continental Congress drank Madeira while debating independence, and Thomas Jefferson raised a glass of Madeira right after signing the Declaration of Independence. While they didn't have a Starbucks on every corner quite yet, coffee was wildly popular during the American Revolution. In fact, when a merchant named Thomas Boylston drove up the price of coffee by stockpiling it, at least 100 women marched to his warehouse and rioted. The riot took place on July 24, 1777. According to Abigail Adams, at least 100 women, assembled with a cart and trucks, marched down to the warehouse and demanded the keys, which Boylston refused to deliver. That is when things took an ugly, aggressive turn. Do not deny people their coffee. Adams reports one of the women seized him by his neck and tossed him into a cart. With no way to escape, he handed over the keys. They tipped the cart over to free him and then opened the warehouse. The coffee was removed, loaded into trucks, and then taken away. That all seems pretty reasonable to a coffee drinker. Unless you're Oprah, bread might not sound too exciting to you, but to the starving Continental forces of 1777, it was a lifesaver. The troops stuck in Valley Forge had requested more food, but instead, Congress sent them a baker named Christopher Ludwig. Ludwig wasn't just any old baker, though. In fact, his actual title was Superintendent of Bakers and Director of Baking in the Grand Army of the United States, which I have to admit is the best LinkedIn title ever. Congress offered Ludwig a deal in which he would bake 1 pound of bread per pound of flour. This would allow him to sell some excess flour and pocket the money. However, Ludwig refused. He told Congress he had enough money and he had no desire to grow richer from a conflict. Instead, he insisted that he would furnish 135 pounds of bread for every 100 pounds of flour you put into my hands. A very classy move. Made from fermented molasses, which is a byproduct of Caribbean sugar plantations, rum has a very long history in the Americas. At first, it was shipped to the British colonies by the gallon, but by the time of the American Revolution, the colonists were distilling their own. New England alone had over 150 rum distilleries. Revolutionary Americans loved rum so much that at the time of the war, consumption of the beverage was as high as an astonishing 4 gallons per person per year. Being, for the most part, former Brits, the American colonists enjoyed many British foods. However, they also had no opposition to adopting new foods that were grown in North America. In fact, Hannah Glass even included several recipes in her cookbook, which she described as adapted to the American mode of cooking. One of these recipes was for cranberry tarts. Glass's recommendation was to stew the cranberries into a jelly, add brown sugar, and then bake with butter and flour. Like most soldiers in wartime, the American forces that fought in the Revolution received daily rations to sustain themselves. The rations typically included a pound of meat per day, which might be beef, salt pork, or salt fish. Each soldier also received a pound of flour per day. In addition to those, the troops would get some helping of peas or beans, some milk, and usually a small quantity of rice, corn, and molasses. However, that was under ideal circumstances, and war is often less than ideal. In fact, the troops often didn't receive full rations, and when they were on the march, fresh milk was especially hard to find. During the long winter of 1777 in Valley Forge, many of the allowances had to be adjusted based on limited availability, and many soldiers just had to go without. Given that they were mostly British, the Americans in the colonies had a special fondness for tea. When Parliament cracked down on tea smugglers, the colonists didn't take it too well. They tossed their tea into Boston Harbor at an event that would forever be called the Boston Tea Party. Once the Revolution started, however, many Americans began to reject the idea of drinking British tea as a matter of patriotism. Moreover, British loyalists who continued to enjoy the drink would often face criticism from their more revolutionary neighbors, which probably didn't help sales too much. Many of the Americans who swore off drinking tea took to drinking coffee instead, but some replaced it with raspberry leaf tea or other American-grown herbal tea alternatives. The Americans weren't just revolutionaries, they were trendsetters. Just a few years after the former English colonists won their own independence, their allies over in France staged a little revolution of their own. In Boston, the French Revolution was celebrated with a feast. They hung a sign reading, "Peace Offering to Liberty and Equality," around the neck of an ox and then led the animal to Liberty Square. There, the ox was carved up and served alongside turkey, punch, and 1,600 loaves of bread. Long live the Revolution indeed. Despite lacking a formal education, Benjamin Franklin is one of history's most famous innovators. He is credited with inventing bifocals, lightning rods, flexible catheters, and swimming fins, as well as making several key discoveries about electricity. He was one of America's most influential statesmen and, by many accounts, a delightfully quirky weirdo. Today, we're going to take a look at 14 peculiar facts about Benjamin Franklin. In the 1720s, Franklin's brother James launched a weekly newspaper called the New England Courant. Ben, still only 16 years old, wanted to contribute by writing a column. However, his brother wasn't too hot on the idea. Undeterred, Ben began secretly submitting work under the name Silence Dogood. Silence, who was alleged to be a middle-aged widow, wrote on a variety of topics, including but not limited to marriage, fashion, religion, and women's rights. Despite actually being written by a 16-year-old boy, the column was wildly popular. Mrs. Dogood was even romantically pursued by several eligible bachelors from the Boston area who sought her hand in marriage. After writing 14 essays under the nom de plume, Franklin told his brother the truth. James was none too happy about the whole thing, and without a column to write, Ben quickly grew tired of working for his brother. Within a year, Ben moved to Philadelphia. In the mid-1700s, the most well-known Western artists, musicians, writers, and scientists tended to live in Europe. America, for its part, was barely a blip on most of the world's radar. But Ben Franklin was busy making a name for himself in several fields, and his inventions, writings, and prominence as an ambassador would make him wildly famous in France. His rotund, bespectacled image was used on snuff boxes and other commercial products, and people would even hang engravings of the man in their homes. Franklin was so popular in France that after his death, his autobiography was published in French before it was published in English. Ben Franklin believed in science, but he wasn't above satirizing his fellow scientists when he felt they were being pompous and impractical. It's this side of him that resulted in the infamous essay, Fart Proudly, also known as A Letter to a Royal Academy About Farting, and To the Royal Academy of Farting. Written in 1781 while Franklin was living abroad as the U.S. ambassador to France, it proposed a scientific study of the way different foods affected the smell of human flatulence. The goal would be to produce a drug that could be mixed in with the food that would make the flatulence not only inoffensive, but agreeable as perfumes. While Franklin initially planned to submit the essay as a proposal to the Royal Academy of Brussels, he never went through with it. Instead, he shared it only with a few friends and correspondents, like Richard Price, the Welsh philosopher and Unitarian minister. We all know that Benjamin Franklin made several important discoveries concerning electricity, but not all of his work in the field was successful. For example, Franklin once almost killed himself trying to cook a turkey with electricity. Cooking with electricity was something Ben had been experimenting with, and he found electrified meat particularly tender. In early 1749, he even threw a picnic on the banks of the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania, where the turkey was killed with an electrical shock and then cooked by being rotated over an electrically kindled fire. After that, they used electricity to ignite flammable liquids, drink a toast with electrically heated glasses, and used electrical sparks to set off explosions. However, the process wasn't quite perfect. In a letter from 1750, Franklin describes an incident in which he was trying to kill a turkey with an electrical shock, but instead wound up electrocuting himself. Witnesses reported him being engulfed in a flash of light and hearing a loud crack. He would later tell his brother that the biggest injury he sustained was to his ego. In modern times, sitting naked in front of your window will probably get you arrested. But in Franklin's day, it was just good hygiene. At least, Ben thought it was. He believed nudity was good for a person's health, and that taking what he called air baths would ward off illness. While science never verified that particular claim, Ben did make some important contributions to the field. For example, he disproved the theory that the common cold was caused by cold weather. Instead, he supported the idea that people often became sick in winter because they were cooped up together, and that the proximity made it easier for germs to spread. Franklin believed the solution was increased air circulation, so he would often keep the windows of his home open and sit in front of them in his birthday suit. You can't unsee that now, can you? As you might imagine, a man who was suspected of fathering as many as 15 illegitimate children, Ben Franklin was really into casual sex. He had several mistresses over the years and a great number of thoughts on how to find willing partners. For example, in his essay, Advice on the Choice of a Mistress, he suggested young men should pursue older women because they were less desirable and would therefore be grateful for the attention. He was also of the opinion that older women were better in bed. Opinions like that now would probably get him in trouble on social media. In 1750, Franklin read an article recounting an incident in the Mediterranean Sea where a waterspout came ashore in Italy and caused considerable damage. Scientific consensus at the time was that these waterspouts were ascending columns of water, but Franklin thought they were columns of air. After further research, he figured out that similar weather patterns had occurred entirely on land. This phenomenon, which he called whirlwinds or land spouts, are today known as tornadoes. In 1754, he actually got to see a whirlwind with his own eyes. He was visiting a friend in Maryland when it struck. Everyone else ran away, but Ben chased after the tornado on a horse and followed it into the woods. He would later record his observations that even though the circular motion of the tornado was amazingly rapid, its progressive motion was slow enough to allow a man on foot to keep up with it. In 1776, the Continental Congress dispatched Franklin to France with instructions to secure military aid and support for the American Revolution. While Franklin was already famous in France because of his experiments with electricity, he actually got even more attention for his frontiersman-style clothing and fur hats. This look was so influential, French women began wearing large wigs they called coiffure à la Franklin. 2 years later, Ben switched to wearing a white hat, and French men immediately copied that look. Growing up in Boston, the young Ben Franklin developed a love of swimming. He was known to use a kite to skim across the water, and one of his earliest inventions was a set of hand paddles that he used to travel along the Charles River. Franklin was so at home in the water, a close friend once proposed that he open a swimming school. He never did, but he was still a vocal advocate of teaching children to swim and later would receive an honorary induction into the International Swimming Hall of Fame. There can't be too many folks who were inducted into both the Swimming Hall of Fame and the Chess Hall of Fame, but Ben Franklin managed to pull off both. He started playing competitive chess as early as 1733. During the 1770s and 1780s, while living in Paris and serving as the U.S. ambassador to France, he was known to be constantly in search of players who could challenge him at the game. In 1779, he even wrote an article entitled The Moral of Chess, which argued that the game strengthened and sharpened several valuable qualities of the human mind. In mid-1700s Europe, singing glasses, the eerie sound produced by running a wet finger around the edge of a glass, were all the rage. Franklin saw them used in a concert during his travels and found them absolutely fascinating. He immediately embarked on building a musical instrument that would replicate the sound. In 1761, Franklin unveiled the results of his effort, which he called the glass harmonica. Exquisitely engineered, the instrument spun glass bowls using a foot-powered rod. The musician would simply wet their fingers and touch the bowls, producing a wide range of tones. The instrument was a massive success and was immediately embraced by legendary composers like Beethoven and Mozart, who both wrote music for it. This success, however, proved to be short-lived and the instrument faded into obscurity. Despite this, Franklin considered it his favorite invention. During his work with electricity, Franklin coined several words that we still associate with electronics today, including battery, charge, and conductor, among others. But coining new words was only one aspect of his interest in language. During the 1760s, Franklin actually developed an entire phonetic alphabet of his own. He believed his alphabet was more natural than the regular one in that it removed what he considered redundant letters, like C, J, Q, W, X, and Y, and limited letters to one vowel apiece. While Franklin did compose a few sample letters to show it off, it really never caught on with the public. Sorry, Ben, we like our redundant letters. From 1757 to 1775, Franklin lived in a 4-story Georgian-style house located at 36 Craven Street in London. In 1998, this house was converted to a museum. During the construction, a worker spotted a human thigh bone sticking out of the dirt floor in the basement. Police excavated the scene and ultimately found somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 bone fragments belonging to 10 separate individuals, 6 of whom were children. The bones were over 200 years old and showed signs of being drilled into and sawed through. If you're starting to think Ben Franklin might have secretly been a serial killer, you can relax now. He wasn't. Historians have noted that at the time Franklin lived in the house, he was friends with an anatomist named William Hewson. Scholars believe Franklin allowed Hewson to use his basement as a lab. Seems kind of sketchy, but just how much knowledge Franklin had about what went on in that lab, though, is unknown. Ben Franklin died in 1790. Shortly thereafter, it was discovered that he left 2,000 pounds of sterling to Boston and Philadelphia. You would think that the cities would be immediately overjoyed, but there were a few conditions. First, Franklin arranged for the money to be placed in a trust for the first 100 years subsequent to his death. Even then, only a certain percentage could be used, and even that percentage was only allowed to be used for making loans to local tradesmen. The wait was worth it, though. This money eventually built the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and the Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology in Boston. Not bad work, Ben. George Washington, the first president of the United States, died on December 14, 1799. While the nation mourned, one doctor refused to accept and concocted a plan to bring George Washington back to life.
Give my creation
So, today we're going to take a look at how one doctor tried to resurrect George Washington from the dead. On December 13, 1799, George Washington rode his horse through icy rain, snow, and hail. Washington hated being late and was rushing home for dinner, so he didn't even stop to change out of his damp clothes. Washington may have made it to the table on time, but he paid a high price for his punctuality. Later that night, the former president woke up clutching his chest, unable to breathe. His wife, Martha, frantically called for help, and Washington's chief aide, Colonel Tobias Lear, rushed to find a physician. 2 men, Dr. James Craik, who had treated Washington for over 4 decades, and George Rawlins, an expert in the art of bloodletting, answered the call. Both came to the house and treated the ailing president throughout the night. Colonel Lear, for his part, gave Washington a tonic made from molasses, butter, and vinegar. If you're wondering how that delicious Colonial Robitussin helped the situation, it didn't. In fact, it nearly choked the president. Every few hours, Rawlins would remove blood to cool the president's fever. By dusk on December 14th, Rawlins, apparently trying to earn his way into vampirehood, had taken out nearly 40% of the blood in Washington. It was all for naught. George Washington died just after 10 p.m. on December 14, 1799, from a combination of a viral infection and the bloodletting treatments. Dr. William Thornton rushed to Mount Vernon to try to save the president's life. A specialist in performing tracheostomies, which were dangerous surgical procedures in the 18th century, Thornton was confident he could relieve Washington's suffering. But by the time Thornton arrived, it was too late. Washington was already gone. Thornton described the scene 20 years later. He said he saw Washington laid out a stiffened corpse and that he was overwhelmed with the loss of his best friend. For most people, seeing the lifeless body of their best friend would be cause for sadness and mourning. But Dr. Thornton wasn't most people, and he wasn't quite prepared to surrender this eternal chess match to the Grim Reaper just yet. Filled with bravado, Thornton believed that he could bring Washington back to life. Thornton wasn't just an expert in tracheostomies. He had also read about the history of blood transfusions in the 17th century. These experiments were deemed so dangerous that the procedure was banned in France, but Thornton still believed it might work. The word crazy gets thrown around a lot these days. It is difficult to hear about a doctor who thinks he can bring people back from the dead without thinking about a mad scientist like Victor Frankenstein. But William Thornton wasn't a mad scientist. In fact, he was a mad doctor, educated at Europe's best medical schools. And he was known for using cutting-edge medical techniques in 1799. Thornton was born in 1759 in the West Indies, but he grew up in England. He went on to train as a physician in Scotland and France before moving to the United States and becoming a U.S. citizen. In addition to his training as a physician, Dr. Thornton was an amateur architect. In fact, Thornton is best known as the first architect because he successfully won the competition to design the U.S. Capitol building. Washington himself gave Thornton this honor in 1793. Thornton's payment was $500, the equivalent of about $15,000 in 2021. He also received a building lot in Washington, D.C., and a friendship with America's first president. Now, before we go on, let's go back to 1492. 1492 was a big year for several reasons. Obviously, there's the whole Christopher Columbus becoming the first European to reach the Americas thing. But there was also the very first known attempt at a blood transfusion. It occurred when Pope Innocent VIII fell into a coma. His physician recommended blood and hired 3 young boys to donate blood to the Pope. The technology to inject blood intravenously didn't exist. So, according to one account, the physician poured blood into the Pope's mouth. To state what is obvious now, it didn't work. The Pope died, and so did all 3 boys. So much for do no harm, Doc. However, the groundbreaking medical work of William Harvey in the 1620s would bring moving blood back into the spotlight. Harvey demonstrated that blood circulated through the body, meaning that it was possible to insert new blood into someone's veins. By the 17th century, scientists had also designed metal tools that could inject blood into the veins. This combination of technology and scientific theory set off a wave of blood experiments. Scientists in London's Royal Society were the first to test Harvey's hypothesis. Rather than attempting a transfusion between humans, they experimented on animals. In 1656, Christopher Wren, famous for designing St. Paul's Cathedral in London, tested William Harvey's theory by injecting wine and ale into the veins of a dog. Not surprisingly, the dog got drunk. Wren's experiment proved the veins transmitted the alcohol throughout the dog's body. One of Wren's colleagues at Oxford, a physician named Richard Lauer, then tried to inject other substances into a dog's veins, including warm milk and broth. These experiments were less successful, but they led Lauer to wonder if it was possible to swap blood between 2 dogs. If blood was nourishing, could it be transferred? In 1665, Lauer successfully transfused blood from one dog into another. Scientists across Europe then began experiments of moving blood from one animal into another. but these scientists wondered if transfusion would alter the recipient. Robert Boyle, famous for his work on gases, wrote a list of questions on transfusion. He wondered things like whether a fierce dog infused with blood from a cowardly dog would become more tame, or whether a transfusion from a poodle would cause a straight-haired dog's fur to curl. Scientists also wondered if it was ever safe to give a human a blood transfusion. If the blood and the soul were connected, a blood transfusion might threaten someone's very soul. Finally, on June 15, 1667, a French doctor, Jean-Baptiste Denis, put all these questions to rest by performing the very first successful human blood transfusion. Jean-Baptiste Denis was already an expert in animal transfusions. He performed public transfusions on the banks of the Seine River in Paris to prove that circulation was real. Ah, Paris. Denis invited gentlemen, noble women, and commoners as he transfused blood between dogs in front of a live audience. Denis ruled out using human blood, declaring it barbarous to shorten the life of one man to extend the life of another. Instead, he decided to use animal blood, reasoning that animal blood had fewer impurities than human blood because animals didn't drink or swear. In June of 1667, Denis gave lamb's blood to a 16-year-old who suffered from fevers. The physician declared the boy cured. Then Denis transfused a butcher with lamb's blood. After the procedure, the butcher was in a cheerful mood and he butchered the lamb on the examination table and took it home for dinner. That's one way to show gratitude. Denis' successful human blood transfusion set off a race for other countries to perform their own transfusions. In November of 1667, the English scientists of the Royal Society planned their own human-animal transfusion. As a subject, they chose Arthur Koga, a Cambridge-educated man who was mentally unstable. He spoke only Latin, and physicians said his brain was a little too warm. The English scientists hoped the transfusion would cure Koga of his mental illness, thus proving their transfusion was better than the French method. Under Richard Lauer's direction, a large audience gathered to watch Koga's transfusion. Lauer successfully transfused lamb's blood into Koga, and a month later, Koga returned for a second transfusion. However, when the Royal Society scientists wanted to perform a third transfusion, Koga refused. He declared that the transfusions had turned him into a sheep and began writing under the name Koga the Sheep. So if you're keeping notes at home, they either completely failed to cure his mental illness or turned him into a witter sheep. So the whole turning a man into a sheep thing wasn't the victory they hoped it would be. But the biggest setback in the science of blood transfusions really came in 1667 with the murder of Antoine Mauroy. In Paris, Denis tried to cure Mauroy with calf blood, but during his third transfusion, Mauroy began having seizures and died. Denis was thereafter charged with the murder of Mauroy, and the trial was nothing short of chaotic. A neighbor claimed that Mauroy's wife, Perrine, had murdered him, and police found mysterious, deadly powders in her house. Another neighbor said a mysterious physician had offered him money if he'd testify that Mauroy died during the transfusion. As a background, you should understand that many physicians were outright opposed to transfusion. One of them was a former pirate ship doctor named Henri Martin de la Martinière, who argued that blood transfusions would lead to the kidnapping of children and cannibalism, which sounded reasonable at the time. Anyway, Martinière wrote to Denis saying, "Allow me to tell you, sir, that Satan reveals himself through your work." Martinière even personally knew Perrine Mauroy and told her to blame Denis for Antoine's death. Like we said, it was chaotic. In the end, Denis was found not guilty, but blood transfusion was banned in France as an unsafe procedure. So finally, this long and sordid road of human-animal blood transfusions, were-sheep transformations, and murder trials brings us back to December 15th, 1799, when William Thornton looked at the frozen and lifeless body of George Washington. Thornton believed he could revive Washington, even after rigor mortis had set in, by combining heat, air, and blood. Just like the movie Flatliners, with Thornton acting like Kiefer Sutherland, he called for cold water to slowly warm the president's body. He then planned to wrap the body in blankets, and by degrees and by friction, to give him warmth. Thornton believed this would revive the president's cold blood vessels. After warming the body, Thornton would perform a tracheostomy. This procedure was quite risky in the 18th century, since sterilization and antibiotics were still a long way off. But it would carry less risk when performed on someone who wasn't alive. Thornton would inflate George Washington's lungs with air, artificially replicating respiration. Then he would use lamb's blood to provide the vital energy to spark the president's life force. Thornton, who had no doubt read about Arthur Koga's transfusion in the Journal of the Royal Society, believed that if madness could be cured, so could reanimating a human. He may miss the part where Koga thought he turned into a sheep. In the end, Thornton's plan to resurrect the president was quickly stopped, being overruled by Washington's family. Rather than arguing with Thornton about whether it was possible to bring the president back, they claimed it was better to leave the president's legacy intact, as one who had departed full of honor and renown, free from the frailties of age, in full enjoyment of every faculty, and prepared for eternity. In short, death was better than a George Frankenstein president resurrected with lamb's blood. Thornton disagreed. Even 2 decades later, he wrote, "There was no doubt in my mind that his restoration was possible. As the great one Wayne Gretzky once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take." Despite there being over 4 scores of founding fathers to the United States, most of us can only name a famous handful. And considering how often we enjoy the more outrageous stories of womanizing and booze parties, it's kind of strange that the name Gouverneur Morris doesn't come up more often. Nicknamed the penman of the Constitution, not only did Morris substantially contribute to the founding of America, but did so while living a life of public sex, seedy affairs, and vengeful dismemberment. Interested yet? Let's take a closer look at the most underrated wild man of the American Revolution. Having grown up in the Bronx, Morris first worked for the New York Revolutionary Government before becoming one of the youngest members to serve in the Continental Congress. While there, he spearheaded multiple committees and became close with George Washington, a man he would go on to support for many years to come. Morris wasn't nicknamed the penman of the Constitution for nothing. The title was quite literal on account of him writing the United States preamble, coining key phrases like, "We the people of the United States." During the Constitutional Convention at Independence Hall, Morris held the distinction for addressing the crowd more than any of the other delegates with a whopping 173 speeches. In a time when some of the most influential men owned thousands of slaves, it might be surprising to hear how adamantly Gouverneur Morris hated the practice. In a speech before the Constitutional Convention in 1787 titled "The Curse of Slavery," Morris referred to the act as a nefarious institution that, in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages. Along with pointing out its unfathomable cruelty, Morris correctly foresaw the rift such an institution would create in the country, essentially predicting the inevitable civil war to follow. Cue the swanky music, because this founding father wasn't exactly a stranger to getting it on in public. And while some of you more adventurous types could possibly relate, we're willing to bet your tales of overt romance don't involve getting busy at the Louvre. Before it was the famous art museum, the House of Mona Lisa was the house for the French king. One particular resident happened to be a married woman who was rather friendly with Gouverneur Morris. In one of his journal entries, Morris described a visit to this lady friend, saying, "We take the chance of interruption and celebrate in the passage while Mademoiselle is at the harpsichord in the drawing room. The husband is below. Visitors are hourly expected. The doors are all open." While that might sound perfectly innocent, it takes a much different meaning if you note that Mr. Morris often used the word celebrate as a code word for sex. In other words, Morris celebrated with this woman in an open Louvre hallway to the sound of a harpsichord while her husband was mere feet away. And that's not the only record of this heroic and patriotic philanderer having a celebration with a married woman. Unless you're doing it wrong, sex generally doesn't result in the loss of a limb. Being the pioneer that he was, however, Morris was up to the challenge. According to historian Dave Kimball, in 1780, Morris was confronted by an irate husband who caught his wife in the company of the founding father, presumably celebrating. After a chase through the Philadelphia streets, where hoping Morris was clothed at the time, Morris was accidentally struck by an oncoming carriage, resulting in the injury and amputation of his leg. While losing a leg might dissuade the less stubborn, Morris continued his long life of sleeping with other men's wives. So much so that fellow founding father John Jay once exclaimed that he wished Morris had lost something else instead. But in 1809, this Evel Knievel of womanizing finally decided to settle down, and at the age of 57, he announced his marriage to Anne Gary Randolph, who was his 34-year-old housekeeper at the time. Along with being 22 years younger, Anne had caught fame for a previous affair she had with a brother-in-law. The affair resulted in a baby that mysteriously died soon after. Accused of the child's murder, Anne and the suspected father were detained and eventually brought to trial. But after a particularly heated hearing, their case was ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence. Apparently, none of this bothered Gouverneur, and by all accounts, spent the rest of his life happily married to the suspected infanticidal bride. True love? Yeah, okay, sure, why not? Being a diplomat to France seems like a pretty comfortable gig, provided it's not during that one period in time containing the most iconic act of civil unrest. Unfortunately for Morris, his time served as minister plenipotentiary to France went from 1792 to 1794, otherwise known as the bloodiest years of the French Revolution. Morris was often forced to face anti-aristocratic revolutionaries head-on, and according to historian Forrest MacDonald, was once forced to ward off a mob by literally thinking on his feet, or foot in his case. When riding in a quite ostentatious carriage, the distressed diplomat thrust his now wooden leg out a window in order to baffle the oncoming throng. His cries of "Vive la Révolution!" confusing them enough to make a speedy getaway. Being strongly and ironically opposed to the revolution, Morris even attempted to rescue Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from their inevitable fate. Failing this, he did manage to rescue and ship their personal furniture to his home in the Bronx, including an intricately decorated armchair that originally resided at Versailles. Because hey, even if you can't save your aristocratic pals, that doesn't mean you can't enjoy their aristocratic comfort. In case you haven't realized it yet, Mr. Morris's first name was literally Gouverneur. The denomination is the result of his mother's very unique maiden name. And Gouverneur wasn't the only Morris to get chiseled into Revolutionary history, as his half-brother Lewis Morris also signed the Declaration of Independence. And if two Morrises seems plenty, the Declaration was also signed by personal but non-related friend Robert Morris. Together, the Morris friends would help establish America's financial security, with Robert serving as the superintendent of finance during the Revolutionary War. Sadly, the fate of these two Morrises parted ways later in life, when Robert lost his money and land and died in a state of poverty. Not exactly slumming it, the Morris family had once purchased 500 acres of land along the Harlem River. This land would go on to become the residence of our one-legged, lady-loving constitutional creator. Named for his family, the neighborhood of Morrisania would become the home to Morris's estate and expand to 2,000 acres. But you might know it better by the modern title of South Bronx. This wasn't even close to the only influence the name Morris had on the city of New York, as Gouverneur went on to play a big part in the layout of modern Manhattan. Just for starters, Morris was one of the earliest advocates for the Erie Canal, his efforts establishing the creation of the Western and Northern Inland Lock Navigation Companies in 1792. In 1807, Morris would be appointed to a group tasked with reforming the entire layout of the city. The commission rejected the European influence of old, opting for a grid system containing 155 streets and 12 avenues. Anyone faintly familiar with the Big Apple will recognize this as the modern and extremely convenient system we have today. You could say that Gouverneur Morris died the way he lived, getting in trouble on account of what's between his legs, or in his case, his leg. In November of 1816, Morris experienced trouble while urinating. He identified the problem as a blockage in his urethra. Historians would later diagnose this as a likely prostate cancer. To be more specific and much more grotesque, Morris had a piece of whalebone handy that he attempted to, get in there and, treat the blockage. Yeah. Ouch. It was this very painful game of self-operation that led to internal injuries, infection, and inevitably the death of Gouverneur Morris. For all his impact on the founding of America, diaries of the French Revolution, and contributions to New York City, it's almost comforting that Morris managed to stay weird and sex-crazed from the beginning to his very painful and uncomfortable end. The first political rivalry in U.S. history was between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. But their beef went far beyond their political differences, and in the end, both men would destroy their own reputations in order to attack each other. Today, we're going to take a look at how the beef between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton was worse than you thought. Okay, time to throw on the original cast recording of Hamilton. When George Washington became America's first president in 1789, he appointed both Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to serve in his cabinet. Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Jefferson as Secretary of State. This probably seemed like a good idea at the time, since both Hamilton and Jefferson had a close relationship with Washington. But we've all had those friends who just don't get along, so maybe Washington should have seen the pair's legendary feud coming. Maybe if he wasn't so busy chopping down cherry trees with his wooden teeth. That's how the story goes, right? Hamilton was only 22 when he served as Washington's secretary during the American Revolution, and they remained close for years after the war ended. In fact, it was Hamilton who encouraged a reluctant Washington to run for president. Jefferson shared a similar background to Washington. Both were Virginia planters, and both distinguished themselves during the Revolution, Jefferson by penning the Declaration of Independence, and Washington by winning the war. Also, both men married widows named Martha, and we all know the power of a shared Martha.
I make you a promise. Martha won't die tonight.
Sadly, the three men did not quite form the dream team Washington probably hoped for. Hamilton and Jefferson both saw themselves as Washington's closest advisor, which sparked a rivalry. The two began to compete for Washington's approval, and that competition would eventually turn the rivalry into an all-out feud. It was a real Mean Girls situation. Hamilton and Jefferson may have run in similar circles, but they were very different men. Hamilton was from the Caribbean, born the illegitimate son of a Scottish peddler. In 1772, he moved to New York City, and the Big Apple turned Hamilton into a proponent of urban commerce. He saw America's cities and its merchant economy as the economic engine that would drive progress, and he believed a strong central government was necessary for the country's survival. Jefferson, however, was more of a farm boy. In his eyes, Hamilton was advocating a return to European-style monarchy, the thing they just fought a whole-ass war to get away from. Jefferson's perspective favored a decentralized government, which he believed would allow for more personal liberty. Both men thought they could sway Washington toward their vision for America. Early in Washington's presidency, the generals seemed to side with Hamilton more than with Jefferson. To say Jefferson took it personally would be an understatement. Jefferson was convinced that Hamilton was a corrupt, self-interested monarchist, and in 1792 he complained to Washington that Hamilton had a squadron devoted to the nod of the Treasury. According to Jefferson, these men wanted to form the most corrupt government on earth, which sounds like hyperbole, but Jefferson apparently really believed it. Washington tried to cool the friction between his two BFFs. In a letter to Jefferson in August 1792, Washington wrote, "How unfortunate, and how much is to be regretted then, that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissension should be harrowing and tearing our vitals." Essentially, Washington was saying, squash this beef, I've got real problems to worry about. But Jefferson didn't get the hint. Instead, he wrote back to Washington and doubled down, declaring that Hamilton's ideas flowed from principles adverse to liberty and were calculated to undermine and demolish the Republic. In short, Jefferson was accusing Hamilton of being a traitor. It's rarely a good idea to be perceived as the dangerously unhinged guy in the office, but Jefferson refused to let go of the idea that Hamilton was a traitor. In October of 1792, Jefferson even told Washington that Hamilton was heading a monarchist plot to seize the government. Jefferson claimed that Hamilton had told him that the Constitution was a shilly-shally thing of mere milk and water, which could not last and was only good as a step to something better. Shilly-shally. Them's fighting words, Jefferson. In response, Washington, who was apparently done humoring his increasingly venomous pal, dismissed Jefferson's claims as ridiculous. The president then added that Hamilton's plans actually worked and were already bringing financial stability to the new country. But rather than back down, Jefferson concluded that the 62-year-old Washington's brain had been enfeebled by age. Hamilton held sway in Washington's cabinet, but things changed with the election of 1796, in which Jefferson won himself a spot as John Adams' vice president. Sensing that Jefferson's pettiness would only get worse now that he was VP, Hamilton marshaled the Federalists, his political allies in Congress, to oppose Jefferson's Republican Party. In 1798, Hamilton's Federalists passed the now notorious Alien and Sedition Acts, which were designed to suppress political dissent. Jefferson raged against the law, calling it detestable and worthy of an 8th or 9th century. As for the Federalist government, it was a reign of witches. And Jefferson saw Hamilton as being behind the whole mess, proclaiming him our Bonaparte, a reference to Napoleon, who was busy conquering Europe at the time and may or may not have appreciated the comparison. For what it's worth, modern legal experts widely agreed that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. So why didn't Jefferson challenge the laws in the Supreme Court? Well, because the country was still so young, the court hadn't yet asserted its power of judicial review. The Supreme Court wouldn't establish its authority to declare laws unconstitutional until 1803. In 1791, Hamilton met a woman named Maria Reynolds. The two had an adulterous affair, which was probably a lot of fun for Hamilton until he found himself being blackmailed by Maria's estranged husband, James Reynolds. Reynolds demanded $1,000, roughly the equivalent of $32,000 today, to keep the relationship secret. Worried that Reynolds would tell his wife about his indiscretions, Hamilton paid the money.
But you must regard it as a personal loan. It has nothing to do with the Treasury.
But he did not end the affair. When James Reynolds was arrested in November 1792 for forgery, he wrote to Hamilton's rivals, promising information that would destroy Hamilton's reputation. Wonder if all that crime had something to do with Maria bedding down with Hamilton. James Monroe heard Reynolds' tale and went to Hamilton to get his side of the story. Hamilton privately confessed to the affair, and Monroe agreed to let the matter drop. But Monroe also made a copy of the letters from Maria Reynolds and gave them to Thomas Jefferson. In other words, Hamilton was totally screwed. It may be hard to believe, but Jefferson didn't immediately use the letters to destroy Hamilton. In fact, 5 long years passed before they would come into play. During that time, the rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson grew more and more personal. Finally, in 1796, when Jefferson was running for president, Hamilton accused the Virginian of hypocrisy. Hamilton said that while Jefferson might seem like a simple, humble farmer, the Virginian's reputation was a flimsy veil to the internal evidences of aristocratic splendor, sensuality, and Epicureanism. Although it's not entirely clear, it seems possible that Hamilton was referencing the rumors about Jefferson's affair with Sally Hemings, who was not only his slave, but also his deceased wife's half-sister.
What time do you get off work?
Never.
Jefferson did not feel like sitting on the letters any longer after that. He turned to his attack dog, muckraking journalist James Callender, to finally reveal Hamilton's affair. Callender published the story of Hamilton's affair in 1797, and given that he was Jefferson's hand-picked messenger, he did not pull any punches. Callender called James Reynolds a pimp and printed Maria's letters to Hamilton. He also attacked Hamilton's loyalty to his country, writing, "So much correspondence could not refer exclusively to wenching. No man of common sense will believe that it did. Hence it must have implicated some connection still more dishonorable." In other words, nobody would write this many letters to a woman unless they were guilty of corruption. As the scandal blew up, Hamilton decided that his only chance to defend himself was to admit to the affair. He eventually penned a response asserting that his only crime was an amorous connection with Reynolds' wife. Hamilton's admission came as a shock to allies and enemies alike, and it ultimately did little to help his reputation. One New Yorker even told Hamilton, "You have widened the breach of dishonor by a confession of the fact." Once news of Hamilton's affair became public, his reputation was destroyed. Hamilton surely blamed himself for the disaster, but he also blamed James Monroe for copying his love letters and giving them to his greatest rival. What the hell, James? Furious, Hamilton stormed over to Monroe's house, where he implied that the future president of the United States was a liar. Monroe didn't take the accusation too well and immediately challenged Hamilton to a duel, which Hamilton quickly agreed to. Monroe called on Aaron Burr to serve as his second at the duel. Burr, who would later fatally shoot Hamilton himself in a duel, spent months acting as an intermediary and eventually convinced the men to call the whole thing off. Hey Siri, what's the definition of irony? The Reynolds affair ultimately destroyed Hamilton's hope for any future office. Jefferson, meanwhile, noted just how useful the muckraking calendar had been and decided to use the newspapermen as an attack dog in his campaigns for the presidency. But Jefferson was playing with fire. In 1800, Callender was arrested for writing a vicious anti-federalist paper and was prosecuted under the same Sedition Act that Jefferson had already opposed. By the time Callender got out of jail, Jefferson had been elected president. Callender expected Jefferson to help him out, but the president just ignored him. So, Callender retaliated by publishing scandalous stories about Jefferson's affair with Sally Hemings. Turns out that the Founding Fathers were basically the messiest clique in high school. In 1804, Aaron Burr whacked Alexander Hamilton in a duel. After the event, Thomas Jefferson, in a show of maturity and respect, finally stopped tearing into his old rival. Nah, just kidding. Jefferson kept ripping on Hamilton for years to come. In a private letter dated 1820, Jefferson complained that Hamilton was chained by native partialities to everything English. He also argued that Hamilton wanted to destroy America's insulation from the abusive governments of the Old World. In another piece, Jefferson continued his accusations of corruption by claiming Hamilton was so bewitched and perverted by the British example as to be under thorough conviction that corruption was essential to the government of a nation. Way to stay classy, TJ. Benedict Arnold was born in Connecticut on January 14, 1741. While almost every American has heard of him and his treachery, many would likely be surprised to learn that Arnold was also one of the Revolution's greatest heroes. So where did it all go wrong? Today, we're going to take a look at how Benedict Arnold became America's most notorious traitor. When the winds of rebellion began to blow, many colonial Americans jumped on the revolutionary bandwagon. But Benedict Arnold didn't have to, because he was actually the guy pulling the bandwagon. Yes, Arnold was something of an early adopter when it came to the revolutionary spirit and the movement to throw off Britain's imperial shackles. As a successful merchant, Arnold lost a large portion of his profits to Britain's famously harsh tax acts. Not being particularly pleased to have his pocket picked, Arnold secretly joined the anti-British Sons of Liberty organization more than a decade before the Revolution officially began. After that, he set out to form his own militia. Known as Connecticut's Second Company of Foot Guards, their early preparedness meant that when the Revolution broke out, Arnold was able to arm his team up and get them on the battlefield almost immediately. Arnold had numerous victories in the Revolutionary War, but his greatest might have been his earliest. After his militia had connected with the other rebels, Arnold was ordered to recruit a regiment and take them to the highly valuable, though lightly defended, Fort Ticonderoga. He took co-leadership of Vermont's Green Mountain Boys and led them to an impressive victory. They actually took the fort without the loss of a single life. The feat was accomplished by a nocturnal attack, and the success was widely credited to the bold thinking of Benedict Arnold and his co-commander, Ethan Allen. The taking of Fort Ticonderoga was a big win, but Benedict Arnold was not about to sit back and rest on his laurels. While Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys celebrated their victory at the fort by getting drunk on confiscated liquor, Arnold was already on his way to the next conflict. It was at the port of St. John on Lake Champlain, and thanks to Arnold's swift movements, he was able to capture the port and several British vessels with a relatively small group of men. The victory gave the Americans complete control over the lake, which in turn gave them a true naval presence on the mainland. It was a massive win for the rebellious colonists, and it only happened because of Benedict Arnold's drive and initiative. Having earned a name for himself as a hero of the Revolution, Benedict Arnold quickly came to the attention of General George Washington. The commander of the Revolutionary forces had a special mission for the newly minted hero: take Quebec from the British. It was a tall order that wasn't made any easier by the fact that the mission came right at the onset of the winter of 1775, which made the expedition north longer and more difficult than usual. Arnold and his men did manage to reach Quebec City by New Year's Eve, but for a variety of reasons, including the weather conditions, their initial strike failed. Arnold did not want to give up and could only be convinced to abandon the attack when he got shot in the leg. By October of 1776, Arnold was already embarking on his next daring mission. This time he was taking a small fleet to Lake Champlain, which had fallen back under British control. The British were planning to invade New York, and it would be up to Benedict Arnold to stop them. Arnold and his troops fought fiercely, and when the battle turned against them, they burned their own ships so they could not fall into British hands. It sounds like a loss, but the determination shown by Arnold's forces delayed the British so long that they had to postpone the whole invasion of New York until after winter. No one knew it yet, but this delay would eventually prove to be a huge turning point in the American War for Independence. The British may have technically won the battle, but when it came to saving New York, Benedict Arnold was number one. Sometimes the best way to get a clear picture of who a historical figure really was is to look at what their enemies said and thought about them. As for Benedict Arnold, before he switched sides in the war, the British viewed him as the most enterprising and dangerous American general, and when it came to battle, there was no one they were more afraid to face. The level of respect the British held for Arnold was evident in the fact that some had nicknamed him the American Hannibal. This was a nod to the legendary Carthaginian general, considered by many to be the greatest military strategist in history, and not George Peppard from the A-Team, although one can assume Arnold did probably love it when a plan came together. In modern times, we think of generals as commanders who bark out orders to lower ranks from somewhere safely behind their own lines. But that was not how Benedict Arnold did things. Not being the type of commander to let others die on his behalf, Arnold went right out on the front line of the battle, putting his own life at risk on multiple occasions. Although he always managed to stay alive, he did in fact have several brushes with death. This included 2 occasions on which he was personally shot, and another 2 separate occasions on which his horse was shot right out from under him. Initially, Benedict Arnold was a true soldier of the Revolution with no plans to switch sides. But over time, as circumstances changed, he slowly began to reconsider his belief in the cause. While it would be nice to be able to say his doubts were founded in some deep-seated moral or philosophical principles about government and democracy, the truth is much more ordinary. Arnold was upset that despite his numerous victories and legendary courage, he kept getting passed over for promotion. The problem was that while his military career was exemplary, it wasn't the only thing Arnold was famous for. He was also well known for living a lavish lifestyle and being married to the daughter of a Loyalist sympathizer. He felt these factors, which made him a bit of a political liability, were causing him to be purposefully overlooked. Then, when he was actually brought up on charges and was reprimanded for his personal lifestyle, Arnold had had enough. Benedict Arnold was known as a difficult man to get along with, and he often fought with his fellow officers. He eventually came to believe that his reputation had been smeared by those in the chain of command with whom he had personal clashes. One of the more notable Arnold haters was Horatio Gates, who fought with Arnold at the Battle of Saratoga. The two disagreed on tactics. When their differences of opinion rose to the level of an out-and-out argument, Gates had Arnold removed as his second-in-command. Arnold considered Gates an enemy from there on out and believed that Gates' opinion was a large factor in why he was frequently passed over for promotion. Everybody has that one friend who can't help but get into arguments all the time. For many of America's founding fathers, that friend was Benedict Arnold. As the Revolution ground on, it got to the point that no matter where he went or who he dealt with, Arnold made enemies. He had an extremely brash personality and had difficulty playing well with others. Moreover, He was the type to brutally criticize and harangue anyone who he disagreed with, while simultaneously accepting absolutely no criticism of his own positions. A famous story holds that when an officer named James Easton questioned Arnold's authority at Lake Champlain, Arnold answered him with a forceful kick. Easton was just one of many detractors whose collective opinions were likely responsible for holding back Arnold's advancement in the ranks. Benedict Arnold may have been one of the greatest military strategists in history, but when it came to handling money, he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Yes, one of the most significant reasons that Arnold turned traitor and sold his country out to the British was because he needed the money. Arnold had made some risky business ventures, and as the war went on, his debts mounted. This financial pinch was one of the reasons he was so upset about missing out on all of those promotions. So when the British came along with a big fat pile of cash in exchange for betraying the Americans, it had to be very enticing. Benedict Arnold had a lot of enemies, but there was one man who did more to drive him from the side of the revolution than any other. His name was Joseph Reed. Like Arnold, Reed had a highly antagonistic personality, and this similarity caused the two men to loudly clash on multiple issues of great importance. Eventually, Reed became Pennsylvania's president of the Supreme Executive Council and decided to use his relatively powerful position to further his rivalry with Arnold. Reed launched an investigation into Arnold's conduct that proved highly embarrassing to the war hero. And when Reed later went as far as to file charges against Arnold, it was the last straw. If you think betraying your country to a foreign power would make you a great hero to your enemies, guess again. After he escaped to Britain at the end of the war, Arnold was socially shunned and couldn't even find a job. He took his son and left for Canada in 1785, but he didn't do any better there. He engaged in some business ventures, but they all failed. And when a crowd of Canadians took to burning Arnold in effigy, he packed right up and wisely moved back to London. He died June 14, 1801, at the age of 60. A popular story holds that Arnold's final words were, "Let me die in this old uniform in which I fought my battles. May God forgive me for ever having put on another." But historians say it's just a myth. As pandemics wreak havoc across the globe, it's hard not to wonder how our founding fathers might have handled the situation. But we know how. Just 6 months after the second inauguration of George Washington, yellow fever ripped through the city of Philadelphia. So, what did our founding fathers do? Today, we're going to take a look at how America's founding fathers reacted when an epidemic struck. Yellow fever is believed to have originated in Africa before being spread to North and South America via slave trade. The first verified outbreak in the New World occurred in Barbados in 1647, and by 1744 it had acquired the name yellow fever. Eventually, it became so widespread it was known as American plague. The symptoms of yellow fever typically begin with muscle pain and fever. Next, the virus would attack the kidneys and the liver, which would cause the victim to become jaundiced, which earned it the name yellow fever. Finally, the patient would bleed internally, painfully vomit, and eventually perish. Cotton Mather, a minister and writer from 18th century New England, described victims of yellow fever as turning yellow, then vomiting, then bleeding every way. On September 9, 1793, a merchant named Samuel Breck recorded the deaths of 45 people who were suffering from yellow fever. He also noted that these 45 deaths were nothing compared to what followed. For just a few weeks later, another 1,000 people met their demise. Breck noted that the last stage of symptoms was insanity. Victims suffered what he called unimaginable torments, which sometimes included sudden attacks of rage. Breck described some cases as so severe that patients were driven to leave their sickbeds and roam the streets. One wandering man even waded into a river and drowned. It was late August of 1793 when a physician named Benjamin Rush, who also happened to be one of the United States founding fathers and signer of the Declaration of Independence, realized the epidemic sweeping through Philadelphia was no simple virus. It was yellow fever. As the news spread, people left the city in droves. One witness to the events recorded that the disease had created a universal terror in which citizens fled the city by whatever means they could, coach, wagon, or cart. Business grinded to a halt, and the streets emptied. Writing over a century later, historian Lillian Rhodes would observe that the hearse and the doctor's carriage were the sole vehicles on the street. And no wonder, for as Rhodes also notes, the hospitals were in a horrible condition. Nurses could not be had at any price. Despite the outbreak, President George Washington and his cabinet continued to meet in Philadelphia as late as September of 1793. The epidemic continued to spread, even infecting Secretary of the Treasury and future Lin-Manuel Miranda musical subject Alexander Hamilton. Washington tried to tough it out, but when his neighbors came down with yellow fever, he fled the city. So did 20,000 others, including Thomas Jefferson. Before long, Philadelphia, which once had a population of 50,000 people, was practically a ghost town. According to Samuel Breck, the city population was reduced by half, yet the disease continued to spread faster and faster. People who were healthy one day would be dead the next. Breck wrote, "The wealthy soon fled, the fearless or indifferent remained from choice, the poor from necessity." In 1793, Philadelphia was still the capital of both the United States of America and the state of Pennsylvania. So when yellow fever shut the town down, the state and federal governments shut down with it. Washington and his cabinet fled in September. Shortly thereafter, the legislature went into an indefinite recess when a dead body was discovered on the State House steps. It fell on Matthew Clarkson, the mayor of Philadelphia, and a small committee he formed to govern the city during the crisis. According to Samuel Breck, most of the wealthy citizens of Philadelphia fled the city. Historian Ashley Bowen suggests this was a politically sensitive issue for the young nation. They didn't want to suggest that Philadelphia wasn't a healthy place for the nation's capital, or that the republic itself was diseased. To help Philadelphia survive the epidemic, the mayor formed a committee that was known as, well, the committee. They distributed food, paid for relief efforts by taking out loans, and helped connect people with doctors. They also arranged to take donations of money and supplies from concerned Philadelphians and Americans in other cities.
Death and grief. It pervades nearly every house in the city.
Benjamin Rush was a prominent doctor, especially when it came to fighting yellow fever. He took on a leadership role. He worked for the College of Physicians to identify the fever's causes, develop new treatments, and educate the public about how to avoid contracting it. He refused to flee the city, declaring, "I have resolved to stick to my principles, my practice, and my patients to the last extremity." And he meant it. He kept working even when he contracted the fever himself. However, while Rush's dedication to fighting the disease was no doubt sincere, his results often left a little something to be desired. During the epidemic, Benjamin Rush observed that immigrants from the French West Indies didn't seem to contract yellow fever. From this, he concluded that black men and women were immune to the disease, writing, "From the accounts of the yellow fever, which had been published by many writers, I was led to believe that the black population in our city would escape it." Rush widely publicized his theory, which ultimately wound up doing more harm than good because, well, it just wasn't true. The immigrants Rush studied had likely developed an immunity to yellow fever after previous exposure in the West Indies, where the disease was widespread. The free black people living in Philadelphia at the time didn't really share that immunity. Unfortunately, they listened to Rush. After Rush proclaimed that black people were immune to yellow fever, members of a religious organization called the Free African Society voluntarily offered to furnish nurses to attend to the afflicted. Their usual mission was to provide aid exclusively to free Africans and their descendants, but they were so touched by the strife throughout the city, they were willing to make an exception. Sadly, this act of selflessness would cost them. The volunteers quickly began to fall ill, and Rush realized he was wrong about their immunity. He somberly admitted he had been mistaken, writing, "The black people took the disease in common with the white people, and many of them passed." 2 months into the epidemic, Benjamin Rush began promoting a treatment, blood leaching. He recommended removing the blood and the purging of the patient's system by administering mercury. Rush insisted the treatment would save lives, but not everyone believed him. Journalist William Cobbett called Rush a quack. In all fairness to Rush, he probably sincerely believed his own science. When he himself took ill with yellow fever, he administered his own treatment and lived. In the absence of a verifiable explanation, the Founding Fathers strongly disagreed over what was causing the outbreak. Benjamin Rush suggested rotten food being sold at the wharf was infecting people via miasma, the now debunked theory that disease is spread via bad smells and polluted air. However, Alexander Hamilton, who was not throwing away his shot to win the argument, believed the disease was being spread by white refugees fleeing conflicts in the Caribbean. The two also argued over the best treatment. Rush recommended bloodletting and mercury purges. Hamilton, on the other hand, promoted what was called the West Indian treatment, which was also known as the bark and wine cure. Hamilton's proposed treatment was quinine bark, which, while effective against malaria, didn't actually help with yellow fever. Still though, given that he wasn't sapping blood from the patient while infusing their system with toxic levels of mercury, Hamilton's treatment would have definitely been the lesser of two evils. Given how little was known about the cause of the outbreak, the Founding Fathers who stayed to work on the problem kept a very open mind. Benjamin Rush even considered the possibility that the illness had come from space, noting that just before the outbreak began, a meteor was seen at 2 o'clock in the morning on or about the 12th of September. While that sounds like a pretty good basis for a sci-fi movie, not every suggestion he had was so fantastic. Rush later decided that the culprit was more likely to be a shipment of rotting coffee. Ironically, the source of the yellow fever was right under Rush's nose, and he never even knew it. He noted in journals that mosquitoes were uncommonly numerous during the yellow fever outbreak. Scientists would eventually determine that those mosquitoes were, in fact, the cause of the epidemic. Rush, however, never made the connection. At the time of the epidemic, Philadelphia was arguably the most important city in the United States. Washington, D.C. was still under construction, so Congress and the President worked out of the city of brotherly love. It also had the busiest port in the nation, which would become the subject of much debate during the outbreak. With goods and people arriving every day, many felt the fever must have made its way into Philly through the port. Both Hamilton and Rush had their eye on it at various points, with Hamilton blaming refugees and Rush blaming polluted goods. The yellow fever outbreak of 1793 brought Philadelphia to its knees. By October, 5,000 were dead and another 20,000 had fled. By the time it was all over, one of the most important populous cities in a proud new nation was literally decimated. 1 in 10 Philadelphians had died. Samuel Breck later reflected on the fact that the lower classes were, as usual, struck the hardest. According to him, no hospitals were prepared to alleviate the sufferings of the poor, and for a long time nothing could be done other than to furnish coffins and men to bury them. In the end, neither Rush nor Hamilton nor any other doctor was able to figure out the epidemic. It ended by pure luck, when a cold snap killed off most of the mosquito population. Not a lot of people know that before Thomas Jefferson was a president or even a founding father, he was actually a lawyer. And one of his cases, an infamous divorce involving an affair with a British governor, rumors of impotency, and a shocking death, directly affected the future of America. Today on Weird History, we're looking at how a scandalous divorce case helped shape the Declaration of Independence. Okay, we the people of the United States should have signed a prenup. So, how did the dissolution of one random couple's marriage help Thomas Jefferson formulate the words of the document that would create one of the most powerful nations in history? To answer that, let's start with the marriage itself. Dr. James Blair was a well-known and respected physician in the Williamsburg area of Virginia. Catherine Kitty Eustace strolled into town on a visit with her mother, Margaret Eustace, and immediately hit it off with the doctor, who was rumored to be on the verge of inheriting a fortune from his politically and financially powerful father. That might have had something to do with Kitty's immediate attraction to Dr. Blair. But hey, maybe he was also really funny. Within just a few months, Eustace and Blair got engaged. They married in 1771, only to separate almost immediately. Eustace moved in with her mother, who lived close by, and filed 3 different claims against Blair, including one asking for alimony. It's not a big leap to assume that the marriage between Kitty Eustace and Dr. James Blair probably wasn't based on love. In a letter to Anne Blair, her sister-in-law, Eustace wrote she only married Blair because of how much the Blair family loved her, which is a weird reason to marry somebody. There might be some truth to that. Though Blair's reputation as a successful physician on the verge of inheriting his ailing father's vast fortune might have been more than the proverbial cherry on top. The moment she moved out, Eustace sued for alimony and lost. She was ordered to move back in with her husband, and actually did so for 4 months, but nothing about their relationship improved. It's kind of hard to get cuddly with someone who just tried to sue you, but they literally had no choice. There's nothing worse than being unhappy in a relationship and not being able to leave. And Dr. James Blair and Kitty Eustace really were trapped, in every sense of the word. Divorce was illegal in Virginia, which fell under British rule at the time. To file for divorce, residents needed to appeal to Parliament, which rarely ended up granting it. Furthermore, this was well before telephones or email, so getting that appeal to Parliament in the first place was a lengthy process. Back in the day, marriages typically didn't happen for love, but rather for financial security and creating families, especially in the flourishing colonies in America. In 155 years of its existence as a British colony, not a single divorce was granted. Therefore, a lawyer working on a case like that of Eustace's and Blair's would not only have to prove that their specific case warranted divorce, but also that the divorce should be legal at all. More on that in a bit. There might have been a reason why Kitty wanted to end the relationship so abruptly after their wedding. According to an anonymous letter, Blair was incompetent, or unable to perform his husbandly duties. Ouch. Blair had previously experienced seizures due to a mysterious health condition, so it's not unthinkable that he was physically diminished somehow, which could have led to trouble in the bedroom. Regardless, the rumor spread, adding fuel to the fire of the doomed marriage. Another portion of the letter, apparently written by the Colonial version of Gossip Girl, also came to the public's attention. This excerpt claimed that the old lady, Kitty Eustace's mother, persists her daughter is still a maid, implying that Blair and Eustace were either unable or unwilling to consummate their relationship. The story gets even juicier. In September 1771, around 4 months after Kitty Eustace and Dr. James Blair married, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, John Murray, came to Williamsburg. The Eustaces had actually known Murray for a while and had been quite friendly with him when he'd been governor of New York. It's good to be friends with a governor. Eustace began spending time with Murray, even bringing him gifts. This was all done while she was still married to Dr. Blair and publicly feuding with him. This stirred up quite the scandal. Rumors spread that Eustace was having an affair with the governor, to the point where Blair even confronted Murray himself. But Murray threatened to remove Blair's brother from his position on the governor's council, and the doctor dropped the accusations. Kinda sounds like an episode of Jerry Springer. Someone should throw a chair. So, what does any of this have to do with Thomas Jefferson or the Declaration? Glad you asked, because here's where Jefferson enters the story. In November of 1772, Thomas Jefferson wasn't yet a founding father of America. He was one of the most prominent lawyers in Virginia, whom Dr. James Blair hired to represent him in court. Because no precedent for divorce existed in the colonies, the case was not only about advocating for the end of a single marriage, but for the cause of divorce as a whole, which is what made this case so special. Here's a quick law history lesson. In the 18th century, a law called Partus Sequitur Ventrum stated that whatever a person's mother was classified as, the child was also. For example, in the 1770 case of Samuel Howell, that law meant that he was an indentured servant. Howell's white grandmother was punished for having a black child out of wedlock by being ordered into indentured servitude. Her child, Howell's mother, remained a servant until she turned 31, but gave birth to Howell before then. Because of Partus Sequitur Ventrum, Howell, too, had to be a servant. It's kind of a bad law. Thomas Jefferson represented Howell, and his defense was built around the argument that all men are born free, years before the Declaration of Independence was written. Still, the judge ruled against Howell, who later escaped servitude thanks to a gift of money from Jefferson himself. Now, that's a great lawyer. For these radical views, Jefferson appeared to be the right man to advocate for the radical act of divorce, which is why Blair sought him out. In a lot of ways, Thomas Jefferson was a counterculture figure in those days. Sort of like a colonial hippie, like a guy in a powdered wig running a pirate radio station. His choices to represent Samuel Howell and Dr. James Blair reflected his desire for revolutionary change, especially because a success for Blair would offer a big challenge to British rule. Divorce laws in colonial Virginia were dictated by the laws of the British Empire, so fighting them was a fight for America's independence. This is one way the case was part of a long process that laid the groundwork for Jefferson's later work on the Declaration of Independence. In December of 1772, this historical soap opera experienced another shocking twist. Dr. James Blair died. This was bad news for Thomas Jefferson, because you can't have a groundbreaking divorce case if there's no husband to divorce. But the story was far from over. As one final posthumous middle finger to Kitty, Blair left nothing to his estranged wife. His property stayed in limbo, and his wife was granted none of his resources. Kitty Eustace sued, but was denied access to the doctor's assets anyway. Undaunted by the court's ruling against her, she turned to the General Court of Virginia for her appeal. Notably, John Murray, the governor of Virginia and Eustace's alleged fling, was a co-judge on the case, because this really was an olden days soap opera come to life. Eustace hired Thomas Jefferson's cousin, John Randolph, and Patrick Henry. Yep, that Patrick Henry, to represent her. Give me my inheritance or give me death. Meanwhile, John Blair Jr., Dr. James Blair's brother, hired Edmund Pendleton and James Mercer to represent his brother's estate. Jefferson served as consultant on the case, compiling a ton of notes that later served to aid his work on the Declaration of Independence. With Dr. James Blair dead, the focus of the case shifted from divorce to inheritance, and whether Kitty Eustace's spousal claim to Blair's properties was legitimate. So what does that mean? Basically, the conversation had shifted to whether the relationship had been consummated, because the law was weirdly obsessed with that at the time, and whether infidelity had occurred on Eustace's end. That meant the court grew intensely interested in Eustace's sex life. And as a reminder, the man she was rumored to have had an affair with was co-judge on the case. Yeah, it was messy. If the marriage had been consummated, Eustace was entitled to the estate in accordance with Virginia law. The court case then became about whether or not the couple had had sex. Eustace's side argued that she had, and that even if they hadn't, that it was Blair's fault because he was impotent. Bit of a weird defense. It essentially boils down to, they definitely had sex, unless they didn't. Meanwhile, the lawyers representing Blair's estate argued consummation had not occurred. The argument wasn't made public for decency reasons, according to Thomas Jefferson's notes, but the court ruled in Eustace's favor. So if Kitty Eustace really did marry Dr. James Blair for his money, she got her wish. After she won the case and she and her mother gained control of all his properties and assets, they promptly auctioned them off. Eustace remarried in 1777, but turned up alone in Williamsburg in 1787 and passed away 1 year later. You could say it was karma, but then again, it was also colonial times. People died all the time back then. How does all this tie into the Declaration of Independence? The cases of both Samuel Howell and Dr. James Blair concerned personal liberty in which the governed had no say regarding the laws to which they were subject. Laws Thomas Jefferson attempted to overturn using the concept of natural right. If he could argue the dissolution of indentured servitude using Enlightenment concepts of self-determination, Jefferson felt he could use the same argument to support the dissolution of an unhappy marriage. Basically, Jefferson proposed that a relationship, be it a romantic or political one, could be dissolved if one side felt and successfully argued that the relationship was no longer beneficial in a material way. That, according to Jefferson, is what true freedom was. And he incorporated these ideas from his case notes when he drafted the Declaration of Independence a few years later. Defending Blair was as much about the case as it was about the future of America. Giving the British authority over divorce in the colonies meant that colonists were not free to govern themselves. They were reliant on the laws of others. The Declaration of Independence claimed freedom from the British, casting off that system, including the British prohibition of divorce. But the newly formed states had their own rules about divorce. The first no-fault divorce laws, meaning divorces that didn't require some proof of wrongdoing on behalf of one or both spouses, weren't passed until 1970. Before then, you couldn't just split up because the relationship had soured. You had to prove that your significant other was at fault for ruining the marriage. And the last state to allow no-fault divorces was New York in 2010. Progress, like football, is frequently a game of inches. Just ask Hall of Fame coach Tommy Jefferson. It's easy to think that the moment the British surrendered at Yorktown, the United States of America was born. But the truth is, transforming the idealistic ex-colonies into a fully functional nation was a long, arduous process. The new country faced years of economic hardship, state governments were widely disorganized, insurrections weren't uncommon, and the Continental Congress was toothless and ineffective. Yet somehow, the Founding Fathers were able to get their act together and form the country we recognize today. Today, we're going to take a look at what happened directly after the American Revolution ended. While the Revolution was very popular in the colonies, the truth is not everyone was in favor of rebelling against the Crown. In fact, historians believe that the number of American colonists who remained loyal to the Crown ranged anywhere from 15 to 20% of the entire population. This fairly large segment of the community was obviously unhappy when the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, and with good reason. After the surrender, many of these loyalists were hunted down at their homes and beaten by gangs of so-called patriots looking to punish them for backing the wrong side. If you're wondering, hey, why didn't you just keep your mouth shut? The truth is, they probably couldn't. While a number of people, mostly wealthy, had the luxury of being able to keep silent about their politics, circumstances made it such that most colonists had to publicly choose a faction. So when the British started pulling out of the states, many of the loyalists wisely went with them. The Prime Minister of Britain during the Revolution was Frederick North, 2nd Earl of Guildford, or Lord North for short. As Prime Minister, Lord North generously lowered the bar for his successors by losing the war and then resigning in disgrace. North tried to end the revolution by diplomatic means. He offered a conciliation plan that promised the British would end all oppression of the colonies if the colonists ended the rebellion. Spoiler alert, the colonists did not take the deal. By the time the war ended, North was exhausted by the tension between the two countries and felt badly burned out from the stress of his position. It's said that when Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Lord North took the news like a bullet to the chest, repeatedly exclaiming, "Oh God, it's all over." The British waved the white flag at the Battle of Yorktown on October 17, 1781, but their withdrawal from the colonies didn't happen overnight. In fact, it took quite a while for them to get everyone out. As late as July 11, 1782, British Royal Governor Sir James Wright and military personnel under his command fled Georgia for South Carolina. Wright's goal was to escape the colonies via the Atlantic Ocean. Several of his ships sailed for New York, while others went to Florida or the West Indies. As for Wright himself, he eventually made it back to London, where he died 3 years later. While the British surrender happened at the Battle of Yorktown, the war itself was technically not over for quite a while afterwards. Official peace talks in Paris commenced a full year after the surrender in 1782. The British were represented at the talks by Richard Oswald, while the Americans were represented by luminaries like John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. The two sides hammered out preliminary articles of peace, which were signed at the Hôtel d'York on November 30, 1782. This agreement brought America and Britain closer to the conclusion of the conflict and would become the basis for a formal treaty several years later. In 1783, the Continental Congress would ratify a preliminary version of the treaty. The agreement was then fleshed out a bit more, and the final version was ratified on January 14, 1784. The British then ratified the treaty April 9, 1784, and on May 12, 1784, the ratified versions were exchanged in Paris. Nothing quite as exciting as a good ratification exchange. The final Treaty of Paris was the product of many months of negotiation and politics. Per its terms, England was required to recognize the former colonies as an independent nation. The British were also required to give the Americans control of the territory between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River, and let American fishermen fish in Canadian waters. The Americans agreed not to persecute British loyalists or block British creditors from collecting debts owed by former colonists. The Americans also agreed to return a great deal of the property taken during the conflict. In November of 1783, the last British soldiers departed from New York. With them were thousands of loyalists and former slaves. The event was celebrated in the new country and became a holiday known as Evacuation Day. The British, understandably, were a tad bitter about it. As a parting shot before they left, they nailed their flag to a pole and greased it up so it would be hard to remove. The British, such pranksters. The flag was eventually removed by a soldier named John Van Arsdale, who scaled the pole and replaced the British flag with an American one. For years after, celebrations of Evacuation Day would typically include a reenactment of Van Arsdale's daring climb. Just 1 month after the British troops left the country, General George Washington, the commander of the U.S. Army, resigned his post. Washington's move was seen as a patriotic act that demonstrated a commitment to his country over any desire he had for personal power. It made him even more popular than he already was, and he was already trending to begin with. The former commander returned to his home at Mount Vernon, Virginia. He remained there until his countrymen made it clear they wanted him to enter the forthcoming election and become the new country's first president. In the 1780s, an economic crisis swept through Massachusetts, forcing numerous farmers deep into debt. The state refused to forgive the debts, and many of the farmers lost their property or were thrown in jail. An anger began to foment, and given that many of these farmers were the same revolutionaries who had fought the British, they eventually took up arms against the government. When the Revolutionary War first started, Daniel Shays was just a farmhand. But after joining the Continental Army, he saw action in several battles, including the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the Battle of Saratoga. By the 1780s, Shays, now a savvy war vet, retired from the Army and returned home to Massachusetts to find himself in trouble with the law for non-payment of debts. He became active in the emerging anti-government movement and soon found himself leading 4,000 rebels in a massive protest against economic injustice and widespread abuses of civil rights. However, while the revolution was ultimately a success, Shays' rebellion was not. The governor of Massachusetts, James Bowdoin, assembled his own militia and proceeded to crush the rebels. For what it's worth, siding against the citizens of his own state wound up costing the governor at the ballot box, and he was defeated in a landslide in the following election. In 1777, representatives of the original 13 states drafted the initial document that would outline American society, the Articles of Confederation. However, after America actually won its independence and became a functioning nation, it quickly became clear that the Articles were badly in need of some revision. For example, the original Articles didn't give the federal government any power to effect change, regulate the nation, or tax the people. A growing consensus emerged that a constitution was needed. So, on February 21, 1787, the Confederation Congress called for a convention to propose a new form of government. Delegates were sent to Philadelphia to craft the new governing document. Over the next several months, various plans for the new federal government were presented and debated. Eventually, compromises were reached, and after a signing ceremony on September 17, 1787, the United States Constitution was completed. While the Constitution is considered the backbone of American democracy today, it wasn't an immediate hit with everyone. In fact, it took several years for all of the states to ratify it. While there weren't formal political parties yet, factions quickly emerged around those in favor of the new Constitution, known as Federalists or Cosmopolitans, and those who were against it, known as Anti-Federalists or Localists. The first 5 states to ratify were Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. Several of the other states had serious misgivings. The document failed to protect basic human rights such as freedom of speech and religion. To rectify the situation, 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were quickly added to the Constitution. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay undertook a relentless campaign to convince New York, then a firmly anti-federalist state, to support the new plan. The three men wrote numerous essays under the pseudonym Publius. Today, these commentaries, famously known as the Federalist Papers, are often cited by the U.S. Supreme Court as evidence of the framers' own contemporary understanding of the language in the Constitution. By its own terms, the minimum number of states required to ratify the document was 9, and after much public debate, that number was reached on June 21st. By the end of July, another 2 signed on, and the process of starting up the new government began. The United States of America held its first presidential election under the new Constitution in 1789. The rules of this first election were extremely different than the laws governing elections today. For example, only white male property owners were allowed to cast votes. Also, the candidate who got the second highest number of votes would become vice president, an arrangement that didn't work out too well and was changed relatively quickly. In addition to General George Washington, there were 7 other candidates in that first election, including John Adams, John Jay, John Rutledge, John Hancock, John was a popular name, Samuel Huntington, Benjamin Lincoln, and George Clinton, who was the governor of New York, and not the guy from Parliament Funkadelic. In what will come as no surprise to anyone, the election was won by the massively popular George Washington, who, in something that would be inconceivable to Americans today, was the unanimous choice of both factions, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. He would be sworn into office on April 30th, 1789, and henceforth be known as the Father of the Country. The colonial era may have been a crucially important time in American history, but it probably didn't smell too hot. Hygiene practices during America's colonial era boiled down to a curious mix of practicality, religious belief, and social position. A lack of hygiene was often thought to be indicative of bad manners, and religious people associated it with the sin of sloth. Today, we're going to take a look at what hygiene was like in colonial America. Okay, hold your breath, because we got some colonial stank coming at you. Captain John Smith was a key figure in the history of the Jamestown colony who recorded his experiences in America in great detail. Those experiences apparently involved a lot of bugs. His writings contain references to troublesome ants and noisy bugs like mosquitoes and flies, as well as a certain India bug called by the Spaniards a cucurooch. George Washington, while staying at a bug-infested cabin in the Shenandoah Valley in 1748, complained that his blanket was full of vermin like lice and fleas. The experience taught him to prefer sleeping outdoors, closer to lit campfires. A Christian missionary named George Henry Loskiel recorded a troublesome plague to both man and beast, which he called living ashes. According to Loskiel, the Native Americans had named them such because their bites were as painful as being burned by a red-hot ash. Back in colonial times, full-body baths of the kind people commonly take today were rare and typically reserved for infants. Even then, the purpose of the bath was more about hardening the infants against disease as opposed to cleaning them. As for adults and children, they didn't usually bathe, they just washed, and they didn't wash much. Each morning, a typical person would likely rinse their face and hands with a cloth using a basin and sponge, but that's about it. Those who could afford a bathtub usually only had one large enough for a sponge bath, and even those were taken without soap. For those who couldn't afford a tub, a dip in a local lake or stream on a hot day was likely the closest they'd ever come to anything like a bath. Indoor plumbing still being a ways off, colonial houses instead had outhouses, or often just a covered hole in the ground somewhere close to the building. If you couldn't make it to the outhouse, you could use a chamber pot inside. These chamber pots had to be emptied regularly, but that usually just involved dumping them out a window. The procedure wasn't terribly difficult, but it did have some downsides. Namely, people in rural areas often lived close to their water sources. The haphazard sewage control meant that waste would often find its way into the drinking water and wind up spreading disease. Interestingly, it wasn't just waste that wound up in the holes. In 2014, archaeologists excavated a dozen brick-lined privy shafts from a site that was an illegal tavern in colonial times. Far from just sewage, the dig found bottles, bowls, glasses, drinking tankards, tanning supplies, wig curlers, and pottery made by local artisans. Colonial America was not big on sanitation. Outhouses were typically close to water sources, and it wasn't unusual for streets to be clogged with garbage and animal feces. This lack of sanitation meant disease could spread quickly and easily. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera were all common, especially during summer. Even the American Revolution was affected. It's believed that 2/3 of George Washington's troops at Valley Forge in December of 1777 died of dysentery, influenza, or typhoid fever. On the flip side, the Continental Army may have also benefited from the deplorable conditions, as large numbers of British troops in the South were killed by various fevers. Even among scientists of the era, hygiene was not well understood. Some doctors believed that cleanliness helped to prevent illness and disease, but others favored theories that revolved around bodily oils. In the absence of a compelling scientific explanation, people turned to religion for guidance, and religion was happy to oblige. For the Puritans, cleanliness was more of a moral issue. They saw a direct connection between spiritual health and the cleanliness of people's bodies, clothes, homes, and towns. Moreover, they believed water was purifying and could cleanse the filthiness of the mind as well as the body. Accordingly, those who bathed were seen as less likely to engage in other sins and less likely to be poor. All of this, however, only really applied to private bathing. The Puritans felt public bathing had a negative impact on morality and was likely to lead to sexual impropriety and disease. They were big on cleanliness. They were Puritans, after all. Keeping teeth clean wasn't a big priority for people in the 17th century, and toothaches were common. The first line of defense against them was the usual natural remedies like chamomile or figs. If it was more serious than that, alcohol or even opium might have been used as a painkiller. Dental professionals were rare, and a person who needed a tooth pulled would usually have to get help from a tradesman like a blacksmith, a barber, or an apothecary. Replacing the pulled tooth was common, and sometimes the extracted tooth itself would simply be reinserted into its socket. More frequently, however, dentures and implants would be used. These were typically made from wood, ivory, and metal, and sometimes healthy teeth could even be purchased from poor people who were, sadly, often eager to sell them. George Washington was, of course, the most famous wearer of false teeth from the period. Folklore usually has him wearing wooden teeth, but in reality, they were made from metal, wire, and teeth of animals. That is badass. For the record, they were painful for him to wear and are said to have distorted the shape of his face, which makes him even more of a badass. Powdered wigs were all the rage among the middle and upper classes of the colonial era. Made from human and animal hair, both men and women wore them, while keeping their own hair extremely short. This was because of lice, which was very common at the time. Shaving the head would prevent the bugs from infesting one's hair. It didn't completely eliminate the problem, though. The wigs themselves were prone to infestations, and they had to be regularly cleaned by professionals. Ideally, wigs would receive this kind of care every week, but as the process was expensive, not everyone was quite so fastidious about it. Wig care included boiling the wig to kill lice and dousing it in fragrances like sassafras, bergamot, and bay leaves, which were believed to have bug-repellent properties. Conversely, the pomade used to style the wigs actually attracted insects, so that the whole thing was a bit of a wiggity-whack. In the 1990s, an excavation took place at the original fort built at Jamestown. During that dig, archaeologists discovered a silver ear picker. Dating all the way back to the 17th century, the instrument had a small scooping tool at one end and pointed pick at the other end. Such picks were used as toothpicks, but also to clean out fingernails and for numerous other hygienic tasks. The scooper side was likely used to remove earwax, which was considered valuable due to its ability to keep thread from unraveling when beeswax was unavailable. Rich Americans have always liked fancy stuff from Europe, even in colonial times. Indeed, wealthier colonists were likely to have imported expensive fragrant soaps from across the Atlantic. However, those who couldn't afford to do that, which was most people, had to make their own soap or buy it locally. One type of soap available was lye soap, which was made using a time-consuming and foul-smelling process that involved mixing lye, ash, and animal fat. Lye soap was extremely harsh and usually used only for cleaning dishes, clothes, and things in the home that needed scrubbing. Doing laundry in colonial times was already pretty difficult. It involved hauling water, heating it with fire, wringing the clothes out by hand, and hanging up items to dry. Using the harsh lye soap didn't make it any easier. In practice, this meant only the items that got the dirtiest, like underwear or diapers, would be washed with any regularity. The women of colonial America didn't shave any part of their bodies. Moral standards of the time meant that women couldn't show any significant amount of skin, so there was no real point. Even hair on a woman's face was unlikely to be shaved, since shaving was dangerous and it was believed that bloodbaths could only be prevented by experienced hands. It is likely, however, that women plucked hairs and used depilatory or hair removal creams. Recipes for such creams have been found in medical handbooks that were in circulation at the time. One such recipe, found in the 1540s The Birth of Mankind, called for a mixture that included limestone and arsenic, among other things. It actually wouldn't be until the 1940s that shaving would become common for American women. America's founding fathers may have known a lot about democracy, but they didn't know much about how to talk to the ladies. Take, for example, Thomas Jefferson, who told his own daughter, "Nothing is so disgusting to our sex as a want of cleanliness and delicacy in yours." Glad we could have this talk, Dad. Yes, cleanliness in women was a major topic of concern, and doctors of the time advised women to bathe as a way to cure illnesses that affected female reproductive organs. The prevailing wisdom actually held that women were able to become offensive to the nose for the purpose of keeping overly amorous men at bay. Dr. Thomas Ewell of Virginia stated it pretty concisely when he theorized that women used smell as a means of defense to ensure protection by rendering themselves as disgusting as possible. I'm gonna guess he didn't have a whole lot of female clients. George Washington was well aware of the risks disease posed to the Continental Army, and he was determined to do everything he could to avoid them. During the Revolution, he made it clear to his officers that cleanliness was essential to health and service, and he ordered them to watch out for contagions getting into camp. His specific concern at the time was smallpox, but the unsanitary conditions of most military camps meant it was far from the only threat. To help control the risk, Washington's men were supposed to clean their hands and faces once a day and their shirts once a week. However, only a few of the soldiers complied with the order. Maintaining cleanliness in the camps required laborers, known as followers. These followers, who could be men, women, or even children, traveled with the troops, cooked their meals, and cleaned up after them. One witness recorded the observation that the troops were not used to doing things of this sort and would sooner let their clothes rot on their backs than wash them for themselves. These followers, who took care of the troops throughout the conflict, are some of the unsung heroes of the American Revolution. So what do you think? Would you have liked living in colonial times? Would you stink the joint up? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.